Hey folks, I'm International Master Kostya Kavutskiy here with the recap for the 2020 US Junior Championship. So this tournament just concluded yesterday. It's the second in the series of the US Championships that are all being held online this October. Of course, we had the previous US Girls Junior Championship, and if you missed my recap video for that, you can find it on the St. Louis Chess Club YouTube channel here. And yeah, so the US Junior was a really exciting event once again. 9 rounds, all rapid 25 plus 5. And the tournament, I mean, was incredibly strong. It was all GMs and IMs, some of the best juniors in the world. Jeffrey Xiong, the top seed, number 2 junior in the world, number 5 player in the US. So really strong field. In fact, Jeffrey and the number 2 seed Sam Sevian are also going to be playing in the actual US Championship coming up at the end of the month. But the tournament was actually won by the 3rd seed Grandmaster John Burke, who was actually always kind of behind Jeffrey in the event. I would say Zhang was leading basically throughout the event and only caught up to him at the very end to force a rapid playoff that he actually ended up winning in pretty dramatic fashion. So let's take a look at what happened. Like I mentioned, Jeffrey, I think, was basically dominating the field for most of the event. Sevian had kind of a rough start, and he was always trying to catch up. But Jeffrey was playing really solid, and he was winning a lot of games in the end game, just kind of grinding his opponents down. This was a good example of that. This is Jeffrey's game against International Master Christopher Yu. And in this endgame with Black, Jeffrey has been putting a lot of pressure in this Rook endgame. So far, White has been holding, but here Christopher makes a pretty typical and decisive mistake. And he plays the move King to E3, allowing Black to go for this King and Pawn endgame that ends up being very favorable for Black here with the more active position. Instead, White needed to just give this check on e2 and just continue playing the game with rooks on the board. Rook endgames are kind of notoriously drawish, so even though White is still a little bit worse here, the position was quite holdable. But the pressure kind of leads White to making this mistake. He didn't have a lot of time on his clock at this point. And now Jeffrey pounces. He goes for the endgame, plays King to d5. White plays King to c3. Had White tried to take the opposition with King d3, then Black can, for instance, play this move a3. White's king will have to start walking over towards the pawn to take it. And we kind of get the same line we'll see in the game where Black's king is actually going to go for the king side pawns and end up winning the race. So things will basically transpose. Instead, White played the immediate King c3. Black plays King to e4, King b4, and now the players have a pawn race. I'm sure Jeffrey had already calculated this all out. Now at this point, White plays King b4. I think his best chance was to play King to b5. But the problem is after Black takes the pawn and we get our pawn race, well, both sides will be queening at the same time, but Black's pawn is going to be queening with a check. So this is probably why White didn't want to put his king on the b5 square. We would end up with this queen and pawn endgame where Black is probably going to win the second pawn here, and this one is more or less losing. So this would have been the best chance, but still losing endgame for White. Instead, White played King b4. Now Jeffrey takes a4, and he could go for the same kind of endgame with just making a queen and trying to get 2 extra pawns. But actually, Jeffrey finds a really smart idea here to play King to e5, stepping his king inside of the square of the pawn here, so that now if White keeps pushing the pawn, Black's king will be able to simply catch up and blockade it. And then, of course, Black's 2 pawns are just winning the game. So White tried King c5 to cut the Black king off, but now King e6, again, he's threatening to come back and just stop White's pawn in its tracks. So White played King c6, but now when Black pushes the f pawn, both sides end up promoting at the same exact time, but because White was forced to put his king on c6, the game ends with a skewer, as if White promotes here, Black will play Queen h1 check, winning the queen. So the king here just ends up being very unfortunately placed, and that was game over. So that was kind of Jeffrey's road to the top. I think Grandmaster Burke actually had a very different road. His games seem to be a lot sharper, a lot more dramatic, and he definitely showed a lot of really good preparation in the tournament as well. I think getting a lot of big advantages out of the opening. One of his most impressive games, I thought, was against International Master Josh Xiong. Here, Burke is playing black in the position, and in this position, white decides to take on g6, fully grabbing the pair of bishops. And on g6, black decides to recapture fg, which is certainly tempting to open up the rook on the f-file, but a little bit anti-positional, of course, because black is capturing away from the center. Well, white plays g5 and h4 here, continuing very ambitiously. And if white could get away with this, then strategically, this would actually be pretty problematic for black's knight, which is now on the side of the board, but with zero prospects of getting back into the game. All of its squares are covered, meaning if white can just fully dominate and restrict the knight, then black will have a really, really tough time in the position. And it's up to black to kind of justify his position with active play, which Burke manages to do quite well. Goes knight c5, queen f7, lining up on the f-file, rook h2, and here comes the shot, knight to g3, making use of this knight that was just on the side of the board. Now, of course, if white takes, queen takes f1 check is going to be really painful. White played bishop h3, and now the attack continues, queen f3. Black doesn't back down at all. Now on f takes g3, queen takes g3, the rook is hanging and e3 is hanging. Of course, white is in check and white is just losing a lot of material here. So the knight is still untouchable, and that means that black's queen here that is now preventing white's king from castling is kind of also untouchable as well. White played rook to d1 and now e4, another really, really strong, and I would say non-obvious move to open up the bishop for white here on b2, but black just correctly judges that the fight for the light squares is kind of more important here. White pushes d4, knight d3 check, rook takes d3, e takes d3. And here actually white misses one moment to make the game quite complicated. He could have inserted the move bishop to e6 check in this exact position, and then after king to h8, then take the pawn on d3, with the difference here that now rook a e8 is going to be met with the move d5. And then white secures the bishop on e6, has this strong bishop on b2, and would have some very, very reasonable compensation, I would say, for the exchange. Instead, in the game, white ends up taking the pawn immediately, but now after rook to e8, the bishop on h3 doesn't activate itself, and white is forced to go really, really passive here with bishop c1, defending against possible threats of rook takes e3 and so on. Black goes rook e4 here, knight to f5, and now white's position is basically just collapsing. Black has the exchange and the attack on the e-file, and after queen d1, knight takes d4, nice tactic, the game was basically over. So these two players ended up meeting in the final, which was quite interesting actually, because Burke actually lost to Xiong in round one of the event and then had to basically play catch up the whole time. But before we get to the playoff, I want to show one of the more interesting games of the event as well. This was I Am Christopher Yu against Grandmaster Brandon Jacobson. And this was a really interesting game. I wasn't sure exactly what happened here, because here Christopher, playing white, makes this move queen to f4. And he did it after a little bit of thought. Well, black goes f6, hitting the bishop on g5 and kind of asking the question to white, where is the bishop going? On bishop h4, there's going to be g5 fork and winning the piece. And on bishop h6, as played in the game, black again has g5, and white has to part ways with the bishop. Now, this was actually kind of okay for white had they found the move queen to f5 with idea bishop takes h6 and d6. This is kind of a computery line. The point is now, okay, the pawn is untouchable because of the bishop on b5 that's hanging, but otherwise white has threats of bishop d5 check and d7 and rook e7 and queen takes f6. And basically, it's a pretty strong attack, and white has a ton of compensation. So I don't know if Christopher willingly was looking for some kind of sacrifice like this, because in the game on g5, he ends up playing queen takes d4, bishop takes h6, and then pushing d6 here. And this one didn't quite feel like it was going to be enough compensation for white, but of course these positions are really difficult to defend and often much harder for the player defending because they have to deal with all of these threats. They have to make sure they're not blundering anything, whereas the attacker can just continue to just make active moves, trying to pose problems, and it's a much easier game to play. You don't have to worry about your king at all. Here, I think had black played rook a d8, he might have had some chances here of getting an edge. This does feel like a really natural move, but instead black chose bishop to d7, which also kind of makes sense just to immediately blockade the pawn. But now Christopher finds very strong move rook e7, hitting the bishop on d7, kind of forcing black to take d takes e7, and this pawn on e7 ends up being an incredibly powerful asset for white. Now let's take a look at what might happen here. If the bishop moved out of the way with bishop to e6, then we have queen d8 check, and black will be losing the rook. In case of bishop e8, then white would again go queen d8, because the rook is hanging and there's actually no way of defending the rook on e8. Black would be forced to take the queen, and white would make a new queen, winning the rook, and now would be exchange up, winning the game. Same thing on bishop c6. White would just go queen d8 check, and because the rook on a8 is hanging, black is again losing the rook one way or the other. Black could try to defend the bishop with a move like queen to b5, but then white would play a4, and it's all kind of falling apart. Queen c6 is unavailable. On queen f5, white would go g4. We have this kind of nice geometry where the queen can't go to e6 either because of bishop d5, and black would be losing the bishop on d7. So Brandon makes the kind of last move that makes sense in the position, queen to a4, defending the bishop and challenging white's queen on d4. And here, generally, I would just expect something like queen takes f6 or bishop d5 check, but Christopher finds really strong move, rook to d1. Fantastic. Down a piece, but he's willingly trading queens because he sees that on queen takes d4, rook takes d4, the bishop on d7 is hanging, and rook d8 is still a monster threat, meaning that even in the endgame, this pawn ends up being a decisive factor. So bishop e8 could be played, but then rook to d8, and black is just losing the game. Brandon was forced to play rook to e8, giving up the bishop on d7 so that the pawn wouldn't promote. But now there wasn't really a lot of hope in this endgame for black. White ends up with a lot of extra material, very active rook, and yeah, with 2 extra pawns and rooks on the board. The opposite color bishops certainly provide black some drawing chances, and it did take Christopher quite a few moves to win the game, but of course the players are playing on increment and in time trouble. So yeah, the technique can always be better. But overall, really great attacking game by Christopher. So that brings us to the playoff match, which was 2 games, 10+2, between the leaders Jeffrey Xiong and John Burke. And now the story of this playoff was kind of interesting. I would say Jeffrey kind of had the initiative and the better position in every single game. For instance, in game 1, Jeffrey had this position as black and is basically kind of dominating here. He has the better structure, the more active pieces, and white has a lot of weaknesses like the c4 pawn and pawn on a2. But what happens here is that Jeffrey ends up rushing a little bit. He goes knight to a4, white plays rook to b7, knight c3 check, king e1, takes his pawn on a2. He wins the pawn, but then after the trade of rooks, white goes rook to b6, and all of a sudden, white has this kind of annoying counterplay against black's pawns on the 6th rank. The engine still thinks black has some chances of being better here, but down on time, Jeffrey wasn't able to really make anything happen here and just repeated moves and made a draw. Instead of going knight a4, though, black probably would have been better off just trying to slowly improve the position. Of course, it's always easier said than done when you're under a minute on the clock. But something like playing h5, h4, or even king to e6 and to d7 just to cover the c6 pawn in advance would have kept things really difficult for white here, and black would have had nearly decisive advantage. In the second game, Jeffrey also had a pretty serious edge in the endgame, but John defended well, and due to the rapid time control, it can be hard to win these really technical and kind of marginal positions. But he was doing much better here as white, finding this move e5, taking on d6, and eventually trading into an endgame with same colored bishops here, where white has a pretty sizable advantage just due to the activity of his king and his bishop, just having more space in the position. But here after h6, Jeffrey again kind of rushes it a little bit with the move c5. Instead, as Yasser was pointing out in the commentary, it would have been much better for white to just start pushing his a-pawn first, a4, a5, bishop d3, pushing b5, and actually trying to create a distant pass pawn on the queen side, playing b5 and then maybe even one day b6. For example, king e7, white can just keep pushing, and then he can create a pass pawn on this side of the board. He can create a pass pawn on the king side as well, and would have really good chances of winning this game. Instead, after c5, black just kind of ignored white here with the move g5. Takes was played, bishop f3, and black just shuffled, and white was never able to make a pass pawn against black, just keeping the bishop on d7 and e8. And the players eventually drew this game as well. So 2 draws in the playoff means we go into the Armageddon game. Jeffrey Xiong got white in this game with 5 minutes against John Burke's 4 minutes. But keep in mind there was no increment for this Armageddon game, as increment would just give too big of an advantage to the player trying to hold with draw odds, in this case, Burke. So this game started off really interesting, but eventually just kind of devolved into a time scramble as both players were under 10 seconds and just trying to make moves really quickly. So Jeffrey Xiong again started off really well. I would say he had a nice position here, and he ends up getting a pretty serious edge with this move knight to h5, trading off the knights, forcing g6, going queen c5, and now white is going after this weak pawn on d4. Black tried queen b6, queen d6 was played, bishop e6, c5, and white is winning a pawn here, as otherwise this d pawn would be taken. Instead, black goes queen d8, white takes on c6, and after a couple more moves here, white ends up going for this endgame. After queen e7, takes with an extra pawn. Big advantage here for Jeffrey. I mean, he really did everything right in this position, but unfortunately spent a little bit too much time doing all this. And of course, as they were making these moves, the clock was ticking down, and here comes again kind of a rash move, b4, allowing rook c4. I think this is probably just the blunder as white loses a pawn here. But despite losing the pawn, Jeffrey keeps fighting, and he keeps pushing, and again manages to create a winning position. But the problem is, of course, he just spends too much time doing it. And eventually the game does go into this really messy time scramble where even though white is completely winning, he still has to make a lot of moves to actually win the game. And even though Jeffrey managed to actually end up promoting his pawn, by that point, I think they were down to about like 10 seconds each. Again, without increment, they're both pre-moving a bunch. And eventually Jeffrey ends up flagging. See how many king moves he had to make just to win the game, and then has to try to make the second queen, but eventually loses on time, and it was game over. I know Burke wasn't too pleased about winning in this fashion, but both players, had an amazing event. They were tied after 9 rounds. They had a really intense 2-game rapid playoff, and of course, Armageddon had to decide things at the end of the day. So congrats to Grandmaster John Burke, who ends up winning the 2020 U.S. Junior Championship. He'll be qualifying for next year's U.S. Championship, which will hopefully run in person and be an incredible event. And coming up next is the U.S. Senior Championship, which is actually starting Saturday, tomorrow, at 1 p.m. local Central Time. And that's going to be a really exciting event. I'll be back here on YouTube with the recap at the end of that. And hopefully you guys will tune in. So until then, take care.